Welcome back to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm Susie Selleck, and today we are in Lynchburg, Ohio. I'm here with Christine Hamlin. Christine, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get started. Tell me about the distillery.
Well, in 1857, John Bowen started a distillery called the Bowen Distillery. And then later in 1857, the company from Cincinnati called Freiberg and Workham came here and purchased the distillery. After that, they started making Highland Rye, which was one of their versions of whiskey. And then they had Clinton Rye, named after Clinton County, right here at our back door. And after that, the distillery employed many of the residents here in Lynchburg. They also got most of their grain from here, local farmers. They kept their own cattle, so they were pretty self-sufficient, giving the slop from the distillery to the cattle for food. And so they really ran their own thing. The distillery comprised of about 30 buildings here in town. They had their own heat tunnels underground, so they would have one big heat source, and they would pump warm air to all of their different buildings. So they had a huge fire in the fall of 1893, destroying much of the actual bottling section of the distillery. The wonderful thing was we had fire departments from all over respond to the fire, most notably Hillsboro, Ohio, which is just 10 miles away. They actually loaded their horses from their fire department into the train, rode in here, made it in 10 miles in just a short 12 minutes. So if you can only really imagine loading all this horses and equipment into there, and these horses and carriages really bumbling all around in the train and speeding the whole way to get here, all three of the fire departments were able to put out the fire and save the majority of the distillery where all of the whiskey was stored. So that was a huge thing that they actually were able to save that. The distillery went on to be very successful. The Freiberg and Workham Distillery Company actually had multiple distilleries also in Cincinnati. So they would move whiskey from one to the other and bottle it in different facilities, which is kind of cool. And so a lot of it came from Lynchburg, but was bottled under different names also. Prohibition, of course, came up, and that's ultimately what put the distillery under in like 1917. And after that, we were one of the nation's largest bonded warehouses for the government. So they actually had all this whiskey stored here for years, and they would only come and get it, say, when they needed to test it, or maybe when they wanted to ship it to Washington, D.C. So amazing that it would just appear there. So after that, through the 20s, 30s, they had multiple offers from different other distillery companies when Prohibition was over to come and buy the distillery. One that I find fascinating is they had a guy come he wanted to start bottling beer here, and he actually filed for the first patent for 10 cans to bottle beer. So it didn't happen, but it was cool that they actually showed the interest in the distillery. So it sat empty for years and years. Wait,
hold on. Was all that bourbon sitting in there with it?
They slowly got rid of it and took it to other places. So that was fun. Lots of whiskey. Whiskey, yes. And so what happened is, as the distillery got older, of course, some of the buildings were tore down, some fell down. We actually have one really large house across town that was made out of the stone from the distillery. So they actually hauled it across town and built the house out of that. So that's really cool. And then, again, years go by and parts of it fall down. The distillery did. So there's still one portion of the building standing, and it's become different things over the years. It's been a grain place where farmers take their grain, and then it's also been a meat cutting place also. So it still has one business in it today.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the cemetery? There's a historic cemetery here, isn't there?
Yes, we have the Morrow Bobbitt Cemetery as it was deeded. The oldest person documented to have been buried there was Ida Hendrickson, and that's dated at 1817, although a tombstone has never been located for that. So there are about 32 families that are buried there. The descendants of Norman Vincent Peale are buried there. And then in 2017, our Lynchburg Historical Society raised funds to put a memorial stone there at the entrance of the cemetery so that we are commemorating those 32 families that are buried there.
So this is quite the site right behind us as well. Go ahead and talk to us about the covered bridge here.
Well, we're fortunate to have a covered bridge here that was built in 1870. The one unique thing about it is that it spans 2 counties. Currently, we're in Highland County. You go to the opposite side of the bridge, and then you're magically in Clinton County. Nice. So the bridge, while it was used and it was one of the only means across the creek here, it was closed to traffic in 1969 when another bridge was built right down the way. After that, the bridge has basically just been kind of a historic site. In 1993, we had vandals set fire to the structure. So it took a while, but a group here led by Bob Pitzer had managed to raise roughly $47,000 to renovate that. So they finished that, rededicated the bridge, and so that's what it looks like today. So it's interesting. It's still widely used. We have people who come from all over to have their weddings here, a dinner party, and take a lot of senior pictures here.
I understand we have a famous person from Lynchburg. Can you talk to us a little bit about Ed?
Sure. Ed Bozeman was a well-known evangelist in the 50s and 60s. He started a radio program in 1962 that went on clear until his death. His sermons and everything are still spoken today. He's still very widely known. The really cool thing is that he had memorized the complete New Testament of the Bible. No. So very, very knowledgeable.
Okay, on that note, there is also somebody here who has written one of my favorite hymns. Can you talk to us a little bit about that songwriter?
Sure. Frank Roush was a longtime resident here, and he wrote a lot of hymns, but probably the most notable one is "I Love Him Because He First Loved Me." So that is in many church hymnals that are still used today and very well known here.
Yes. So. And yet another fantastic writer from here. Talk to us a little bit about Lily.
Sure. Lily Ferris was one of our first 2 graduates from here at the Lynchburg High School. So that's wonderful. And then years later, she did start teaching here at the Lynchburg School, so she carried that on. By the time she had started teaching, she was already a very well-known, nationally published author. So she had written many children's books, a very long series of those books, and the residents here in Lynchburg who have copies of those that are actually signed, by her, they're just a prized possession. So those children's books are really cool. So we're happy to have her as part of our history. We are happy to say that Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, his parents and grandparents, made Lynchburg home for years, and he would come here and spend his summers as a child riding his bike and things like that. And he's very fond of his time he spent here in Lynchburg. He's even written about it in one of the Guidepost magazines that he had that magazine and widely published.
Well, how about the Masonic Lodge? I saw that that's here. And I don't know how long that's been here, but are they still active today?
Yes, the Masonic Lodge is very active here in our town. They actually maintain 2 of our big cemeteries. It's the same chapter that started in 1849. So they've been around a long time here in the town.
Christine, this being a whiskey town, I know you've got to have a couple of funny stories. So we can start with the stamp one because I loved that one. I thought it was great.
Well, while someone here in town was cutting down a tree, their chainsaw obviously hit something very hard, and to their surprise, they started cutting away the wood and found an actual barrel stamp that they used to use here at the distillery. So once they got the wood taken away, we actually uncovered it and found that it was actually one of the markers that they'd get hot in a fire and then burn the logo into the barrels here. So it's really cool.
Yeah, can't wait to see that when we go back uptown. Come on, give me another one.
Well, one of the famous whiskeys that was made here in Lynchburg was called Cyrus Noble Whiskey. They named that after one of their employees who had worked there a long time and then had finally become a foreman or a supervisor there at the distillery. And apparently, as the story goes in the newspaper, he was very intoxicated one day, fell into the vat of whiskey, and therefore they named that, as they bottled it, the Cyrus Noble Whiskey. What's really great is later in life, after he'd lived his life here in Lynchburg, he went to California, and under Crown Distilleries, they still continued to manufacture and sell Cyrus Noble Whiskey. It was considered a small batch whiskey.
All right, and give me one more. I know you got one more.
Well, one of the Linus Brothers that lived here in Lynchburg and also worked at the distillery, it was very common for the guys to walk to work. Everything in Lynchburg here is very close, so you could walk to work. He would walk to work, walk home for lunch, and they wore galoshes or rubber boots to work and everything so they wouldn't get their feet wet. He would go by one of the big vats of whiskey and casually turn the spigot on, fill his boots up with whiskey, slush home, empty his boots, go back to work after lunch, and do the same thing when he would leave work for the day. So he had a lot of whiskey at his house, but I don't think I'd take a drink after it had been on his feet.
No, I don't think so either. I don't. Well, maybe. I don't know. I do love whiskey. Christine, it seems to me like there is quite a bit of compassion here in Lynchburg's history. Can you talk a little bit about the Underground Railroad being part of this town as well?
Sure. Mary Jane Hunt helped along with Levi Coffin here, just north of town. While it wasn't an Underground Railroad stop, she did help be the exit up to Clinton County, where the slaves who were trying to escape would go and then later stay with Quakers there in Clinton County. So during the Civil War, we had a place here called the Barracks, which was more of a stopover point where they would gather the troops. And it said in all the local papers that the Lynchburg residents really fed them well, feed them well before they go off, and then they only have rations to eat once they get into service.
Can you tell us a little bit about Mr. Baring?
Sure. John Baring lived here his whole life. He was a member of the 48th OVI. He is a descendant of the people who the Bering Straits were named after. So it's kind of cool to have somebody who had famous explorers living here in town.
With every great town comes America's pastime. Talk to us a little bit about the baseball history here in Lynchburg.
Cool. Since the early 1900s, Lynchburg's always been home to several baseball teams. In the 1950s, our local grocery owner, Woody Williams, had a team, semi-pro league called the Buckeye League. From that, we had two famous people leave. We had Bobby Dernbaugh went to the Cincinnati Reds in 1957, and then we also had one go to the Pittsburgh Pirates. His name was Cal Hogue. Another local resident, Bill Feaster, spent his entire life coaching Little League, was very dedicated there every day, has many people here in town who have fond memories of spending days at the baseball park. And our two baseball fields are named after those two people, Bill Feaster Field and Woody Williams Field.
Awesome. Well, today's a perfect day for baseball. So, Christine, we've got two people here who have helped you do a lot of the research to get this together. Do you want to introduce them really quickly with a nice thank you?
Sure. Our thanks to the whole Historical Society. And this is my husband, Brad Hamlin, and this is Jenny Ronimus.
Well, you guys, thank you both so much for and Christine for getting this all together. It was a great interview today. And thank you for watching another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. Today, we were in Lynchburg, Ohio, here with this great crew. Remember, travel slowly and stop often. Bye for now.